The archaeologist was uneasy about being followed by a man that insisted on wearing a gas mask, but she was glad to have someone armed escorting her. She led with the torch burning bright, casting shadows on the ancient walls. The pyramid she was exploring was an amazing discovery, but she didn't understand how she got there, and she severely regretted not having her gear. The survivalist behind her was quiet and seemed uneasy. She kept glancing back, partially worried about him attacking her, but just as concerned that he might disappear and leave her alone. As she rounded corner after corner, she realized that she may be in trouble, with only one torch in the darkness, but that problem soon extinguished as she entered a large chamber and saw something she never expected. Vlad awakened in a dark and damp room to the sound of a distant shriek. He worried if the Turks had finally captured him, but this dungeon was far different in its style to be Turkish. His last memory was of being surrounded by enemy soldiers, fighting wildly in a rampage. Had he been slain? Was he in the afterlife, he wondered? No matter. Better to face any threat with courage, whether in the afterlife or not. He grabbed his weapons and noticed some movement in a small, slimy mound nearby. It looked like a stump overgrown with moss, but it began unfolding like a wilting flower. Before he could decide whether to get closer to look or to back away in caution, a small creature resembling a giant spider but with a tail leapt from the egg onto the wall. It put its tail into a hole just a second after Vlad realized that the lumpy growth on the wall was another being that screamed before being silenced by the tail of the small creature. He raised his weapon, ready to attack the creature, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed more eggs beginning to stir. Bob was a sheriff's deputy that thought he'd seen it all and been in the worst situations in life. He experienced the depths of evil that mankind could sink to while serving as a prison guard. He witnessed gruesome crime scenes. He'd even barely survived being ambushed by a cop-hating serial killer. But what he saw now was too unreal to believe. He had awakened in a large, dark, and damp room. The stirs and gasps of others around him were silenced as their confusion succumbed to terror. A giant creature stood chained between some pillars and bound to some disgusting blob he reasoned could only be an egg sac. It hissed in a terrifying chorus to the rhythmic steam coming from the darkest corners of the chamber. The other people around him seemed totally out of place. What did a cheerleader, a jock, a pizza delivery boy, scientists, an inspector, a juggler, a clown, and a reporter have in common, aside from being cliché? He realized it shortly after. A stout man in a fancy costume walked confidently to the middle of the chamber, stood before the bound and hissing monster, removed his top hat, and declared loudly, "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to a circus unlike you have ever experienced. Be prepared to be amazed. Be prepared to have your senses stimulated. Be prepared to serve your new queen." He turned to bow before the creature that flicked a spiky tail around to pierce the ringmaster through the sternum and lift him to its jaws. It seemed to grin with drooling teeth as it bit his head off and ripped the body in half with the tail. Shadows began stirring in the corners, up and down the pillars, and even creeping upon the ceiling. Bob reached for his service revolver and suddenly realized what all the people had in common. Everyone, including himself, must have been brought there defenseless, to be victims. The chaos that began was an epic massacre. People fled in all directions as creatures, perhaps demonic, emerged to swiftly tear them apart. Limbs were actually flying through the stale air. Internal organs splattered as they were flung against the stone walls. He felt powerless. As he ran for cover, he crashed against a figure that must have been invisible. He was then lifted by the neck and tossed aside just in time to avoid being pounced upon by one of the many black creatures. This unfortunate one was then pierced in its elongated skull by the cloaked figure's spear. The spear began to sizzle while a sudden blast emerged from the figure's shoulder, and the black creature's head exploded. Bob was splattered with dark blood that melted his skin. As he writhed on the ground trying to extinguish the agony by rolling on his melting flesh, his last glimpses in life were of a medieval warrior, a woman with a torch, and a man in suspenders and a gas mask fighting off the dark creatures by hand. He muttered a final prayer, and his pain ended. Like, comment, share, subscribe, follow, submit, obey.